Okay, we've now looked at some ways of thinking about minds from ancient times and then up to the Enlightenment period with Descartes in the mid-1600s. From there, we're going to jump up to the 20th century. But first we need to take stock. In the previous lesson, we discussed Descartes' dualism and two big challenges for solutions to the mind-body problem. These challenges are widely known as the problem of other minds and the problem of mental causation. We also noted that some questions that were considered philosophical or metaphysical in the past have been transformed into scientific or empirical questions in more recent times. Aristotle postulated 5 fundamental elements in his cosmology, but in our time, inquiry into the basic building blocks of nature is often the job of physicists. But the nature of minds is not a question we're going to resolve by smashing particles together in a super collider. There are several reasons for that, but one is that it doesn't seem like the kind of question that depends merely on collecting more data. It looks like a question that will also require weighing the pros and cons of different theories. If so, how do we do that? The first step is to figure out what we expect out of a successful theory of minds. At this point, we're in a good position to identify some of the things we expect or desire out of a theory about minds, the so-called desiderata. And we can use those desiderata to compare the proposals we've already seen along with those we're going to explore in the coming weeks. I'm going to emphasize 4 features. First, a theory of minds generally ought to say that there are minds, that minds, psychological processes, or mental states are real. Needless to say, a theory about minds doesn't have to say that minds are a kind of substance, but that's certainly one way that they could be real. And we could even be convinced by a theory that says we're wildly mistaken to believe in minds at all. That is, an eliminativist theory that denies there are minds. It wouldn't be the first time that a contemporary theory told us that something that used to seem obvious was in fact false. But we sure seem to experience our own minds. And as we've noted before, we have a variety of social and cultural commitments that depend on some creatures having minds. So, given how intertwined minds are with other parts of our conceptions of ourselves and the world around us, it's a tall order to get us to abandon our beliefs about minds and psychological processes. We expect our theories to confirm that minds are real. Second, and relatedly, as we detailed in the previous lesson, we expect that minds and mental states will be the kinds of things that can causally interact with the world. That is, we expect a solution to the problem of mental causation. Again, we might be convinced to abandon mental causation and accept epiphenomenalism if there were very powerful reasons to do so. But epiphenomenalism is nobody's first choice. It would always be a backup position that we could be forced to accept only under immense argumentative pressure. Barring that, we expect our theories to vindicate the causal efficacy or effectiveness of minds. Third, theories about minds should tell us that some things have minds and some things don't have minds. Of course, it's not that we expect to be told that our common sense or folk beliefs are always right, but we set out to understand the phenomena in the world that we take to be related to mental or psychological capacities, and we largely pick those out pre-theoretically by pointing at them, that is, by ostension. So if our theory tells us that too many of the standard examples of minds are not minds at all, we're going to be suspicious that we've pointed at the wrong phenomenon altogether. We expect that the canonical cases of things with minds will turn out to have minds. First and foremost, ourselves, that is, typical adult human beings. And we expect that the canonical examples of things without minds will turn out not to have minds. Things like rocks, rivers, and beats. We can think of this requirement in terms of the theories having the right range of generality, that they cover enough things, but not too few or too many. This requirement leaves a great deal of gray area around the edges. As we've already noted in our previous discussions of aliens, robots, bats, automata, Venus flytraps, octopuses, dogs, Siri, and more. Whatever the details around the edges, we have to be convinced that a solution to the mind-body problem has the right kind of generality. Finally, we expect a theory of the nature of minds to justify our knowledge about minds. As with the desiderata of generality, we can accept that there might be substantial disagreement among theories about just how much we can know about our minds and the minds of others. But if a theory tells us we can't know anything about our own minds, that'll be a hard pill to swallow. Our reasons for being interested in minds include the fact that we sure seem to know about our own. That's the whole basis for Descartes' proposal, after all. And we typically think that we can know at least some basic things about the minds of other people, about their beliefs and desires, sensations, and more. If you tell me that Paris is the capital of France, then I think I can know on that basis that you believe that Paris is the capital of France. If I see my daughter get kicked during a soccer game and make a wincing expression, and later I notice a big bruise on her leg, then I think I can know that she felt a painful sensation when she was kicked. In short, we expect some kind of solution to the problem of other minds. This last requirement needs to be elaborated a bit more. In 1640 or even 1840, it might have been good enough to say that we expect some kind of response to the problem of other minds. But these days, we think about minds and psychology a bit differently. In particular, we have a science of psychology. Psychology, as a science, attempts to give systematic and precise explanations of mental states and explanations of the behavior of people and animals in terms of their mental states and processes. More accurately, we have a range of cognitive and mind sciences that study the conscious and unconscious psychological processes of individuals, their interactions in groups and societies, the ethology of various animals and maybe plants, and the possibility of alien or artificial intelligences. Now, as always, we can't expect every account of minds to vindicate every claim of every one of our psychological and cognitive sciences. In fact, on the contrary, we might hope that a theory about the nature of minds would help us make choices among various competing empirical theories. But we do expect these days that a solution to the mind-body problem will dovetail with some solution to the problem of other minds. And in particular, we expect that it will justify the existence of a science of psychology. Put another way, we expect a solution to the mind-body problem to give minds a role in explanation. Of course, the aspirations and details of psychological theories vary widely, as we'll see in the next lessons. But we generally expect it to turn out that psychological sciences aren't a total sham, that there are some legitimate psychological explanations. So we're going to think about this last desideratum as making an explanatory demand, that an answer to the mind-body problem should also underwrite some kinds of psychological explanation. Now we can use these four desiderata or criteria to systematize our inquiry into the nature of minds. At this point, we've encountered one detailed theory of minds and a second one in passing: substance dualism and eliminativism. The dualist says that minds are a kind of substance, so they're definitely real. The eliminativist denies that there are such things as minds or mental states, so they're definitely not real. From there, eliminativism is pretty easy. If there are no minds, then minds don't cause anything. And it will be a tall order for the eliminativist to convince us that the theory covers the right things and has the right generality, because it's telling us that there are no minds or mental states, whereas the phenomena of mentality is exactly what we set out to study. And there'll be no explanatory science of psychology either, because there's nothing to explain. Maybe eliminativists can convince us that there are no real psychological processes because it's all just neurons and molecular chemistry, and psychology is merely a useful approximation of the truth. Or maybe they'll convince us that although ordinary psychological categories are false, there are similar kinds of things, and those allow us to vindicate our moral and epistemological practices. It's easy enough to imagine that outcome in general, but it's harder to see how it will work in detail. What would it take to convince us of those things? This is something we should keep an eye on. Without a powerful story, however, it seems like eliminativism is going to strike out on all the desiderata. Dualism, then, has a better start because it definitely asserts the reality of the mental. But then things get difficult. As we discussed in the previous lesson, the dualist has no good account of mental causation. And although the dualist can say that only some things have minds or souls and not others, that looks rather ad hoc. After all, if minds and bodies are really wholly distinct, then there's nothing that keeps minds attached to any kind of body. Descartes says that only human beings have minds and not even animals. But why? Later dualists sometimes allowed that animals could have minds, but they still need to tell us which things get them and which don't. You might know, for example, John Locke, a political philosopher who greatly influenced the American revolutionaries and the Declaration of Independence. On minds, Locke was a dualist, not unlike Descartes, but he held that it's only God's goodness that ensures that humans have minds and prevents minds from being put into things like stones or trees. Finally, if minds are distinct substances from bodies, then even if we can somehow explain how minds and bodies interact, we still face the most serious version of the problem of other minds. Literally everything we see bodies do is something they could do without minds, according to the dualist. So if psychology is the science of minds and mental states, then it seems like an empirical science of psychology is impossible, for there aren't going to be any possible observations that could distinguish between things with minds and mere automata. Maybe we can know about our own minds by direct observation following Descartes' cogito reasoning, but we can't observe the minds of others or know about them by direct acquaintance. And any inference from their behavior to minds is undermined by the possibility that the body is operating all on its own. This might strike us as fantastical, but for a dualist like Descartes, and moreover, one who hopes to build the sciences on a foundation of certainty, the mere possibility that what we encounter is just bodies without minds is a serious alternative that he would have to rule out. If we can't rule it out, then it's hard to see how Descartes could account for any explanatory practices involving mental states. In fact, one might well think that it's precisely because he couldn't conceive of a science of the mind that Descartes concludes that the stuff that science studies, bodies, can't think. Using these four desiderata together as a kind of scorecard of theories will give us a way of starting to compare proposed solutions to the mind-body problem. Do they show us how minds can be real and causally efficacious? Do they attribute minds and mental states to an appropriately general range of things? Can they justify the existence of an explanatory science of psychology? By these criteria, we can see that eliminativism and substance dualism don't do very well. Indeed, it's reasonable to wonder how dualism got so far on so little. The answer is that as long as we're thinking of bodies like Descartes, as basically complex arrangements of gears, tubes, levers, and pulleys, as long as we think like that, it seems impossible that any combination of those could produce the range of activity and meaning that are characteristic of minds, of thoughts, or of sensations. Our old friend Gottfried Leibniz gives us a terrific metaphor for envisioning this point of view. He says, "Moreover, we must confess that perception, and what depends on it, is inexplicable in terms of mechanical reasons, that is, through shapes and motions. If we imagine that there's a machine whose structure makes it think, sense, and have perceptions, we could conceive it enlarged, keeping the same proportions, so that we could enter into it as one enters into a mill. Assuming that, when inspecting its interior, we'll only find parts that push one another, we'll never find anything to explain a perception." From this, Leibniz concludes, as Descartes did, that the explanation for perception or thought cannot be in the machine. Plainly, some 400 years later, we have a richer and more sophisticated understanding of matter and machines than Descartes or Leibniz did. The question is whether that will help us formulate a better solution to the mind-body problem. Can some contemporary theory do better than eliminativism or dualism at accounting for these four desiderata on solutions to the mind-body problem, vindicating that minds are real and causally efficacious, attributing minds and mental states to an appropriately general range of things, and justifying the existence of an explanatory science of psychology? What do you think?